Hello everybody, and welcome to our study in Genesis. We're going to be in chapters 40 and maybe even 41 tonight. We'll get some really neat stories to talk about, and some amazing things happen, and we're definitely going to learn about dreams and how that's allowed God's man, Joseph, to be able to be used greatly for his glory. So we are in 40 and 41 tonight, but as it is our custom, can we do a little review of Genesis 39? And I'll just throw it out there and say, can anybody remember, or what is it you do remember about 39? And it's very soap opera-ish, those soap opera lovers.
Joseph was bought by the captain of the guard.
He was sold into slavery by his brothers. He's bought by the captain of the guard, a senior officer in Pharaoh's household.
And the Pharaoh really took a liking to him.
The Pharaoh?
Well, Potiphar?
Potiphar is the captain of the guard. He's the guy that bought him and really likes him a lot. What is it he likes about him?
He could trust him.
He could trust him.
Yeah, he was trusted.
And put him in. He's the trustee for the whole household.
Yeah.
Everything is there. Wait a minute, but you're getting ahead of us, all right? All right, Janice is notorious for getting ahead of us. She reads ahead, all right? But there was one thing, obviously, that Potiphar did not give him authority over.
His wife.
His wife. All right.
And the wife had the hots for him.
And the wife had the hots for him, remember?
Yeah.
It even talks about how much of a stud this guy is.
Yeah.
She has the hots for him, and he does what?
He ran away from her.
He rejects her? Say again?
She became a prostitution.
Oh, and she's running ahead of us.
Yeah, you're ahead of us again. All right. So, yep. So
she rejected him.
He rejects her. All right. And then finally, one time, she dismisses all the servants. All right. Potiphar is away as well, and she makes a pass at Joseph. And then what happens?
He rejects her.
He does, and
runs out of the house.
Runs right out of the house, but leaves his cloak. Leaves his coat.
Yeah, he had to.
Yeah, because she's probably holding on to it. He's trying to get away. He slips out of it, and boom, he hits B for Boogie, and he's long gone. But
then she tells her husband.
Everybody. She tells the servants, first of all.
She calls the servants.
This guy that he brought into our midst to make fun of us.
Yeah.
This Hebrew.
Yeah.
Right?
He attacked her.
And she claims that he attacked her.
Yeah, she kept the cloak.
And kept the cloak as evidence.
As evidence to show.
You know what? But I think that the husband put him in his prison, not the bad prison, because I think the husband really believed that Joseph didn't.
That's a possibility.
I got a funny feeling that the husband didn't really think.
Right.
I think the husband knew the wife more.
Right.
He realized the type of woman she was.
The story can support that. The story can support it because he does.
I think she was kind of a flirt.
She's definitely a flirt. And yes.
Because, a lot of times men get blamed for things that it ain't their fault.
Yes, especially if you're a younger, good-looking man and stuff like that.
Everybody.
And stuff. Yeah, and the story supports that. There's a good chance because Potiphar does not send Joseph to the regular prison. Sends him to Pharaoh's prison, the prison where Pharaoh's prisoners go to, and he's going to meet other members of Pharaoh's court there as well. And so Joseph does get taken that way. Like we said, he does get sent to it. Remember when Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce Joseph, he says, how could I do this and sin against God? Not against Potiphar. Not against himself. He won't sin against God. That's his commitment to God. And so that's what happens. As we said, we saw that Joseph actually gets a break. He is actually sent to the prison that holds Pharaoh's prisoners. And what happens to him there?
Put in charge.
He's put in charge.
Yeah, he's put in charge.
It automatically impresses the warden. The warden sees that he's a man of integrity, that he can be trusted, that he's also a man of ability, and puts him in charge. All right, and that's how it finishes up. The end of verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him.
Yep,
he showed him kind. Yep, great. Keep reading.
So Joseph was put in charge, and the warden never paid any attention to him because he knew everything was under his care, and the Lord was Joseph.
Yeah, despite his reputation, despite for the reason why Joseph was sent there. And Lynn, that might support your point even more. That here Potiphar tells the warden, He's here because I got to stand up for my wife.
Yeah.
Because the warden's going to be nuts to
Yeah.
trust Joseph after what happened at Potiphar's.
Yeah.
But for some reason, Joseph gets honored. All righty.
Yeah.
Good job, everybody.
If that would have been somebody else, and he believed that Joseph really attacked his wife, he probably would have had him killed
Yes. Yes.
instead of just putting
Them in prison.
his prison.
Put him
Instead
in
of the
Pharaoh's
bad
prison.
prison.
Right. You'd think you would be very, very angry if you really did live
Yeah.
it. Lynn, you have a very good point. That's a very, very good point.
Because I'm like, why is he putting him in just his prison?
Right.
Why didn't he? Because you had said
I
he
did-
didn't put him in the bad prison.
He did. No, the Bible says that.
He
The
didn't.
Bible
The
says
Bible
that.
said
Well,
Because he could put him in
that's what he
Pharaoh's.
was saying on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I'm
Right.
saying, why wasn't he put in
Yeah.
the bad one?
Right.
And I'm
Put
like,
him in the good one.
and the Pharaoh could have had him killed.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, now don't get ahead of us. Okay, because we'll be reading about Pharaoh here in a minute.
Okay.
But that was excellent. Very good review. It's great to see that you guys are staying on top of this, because it's easy, because there's so much that goes on that it's easy to forget some of these
Oh,
things.
yeah. There's a
All right.
lot that goes on sometimes.
The magic phrase is, "How can I sin against my God?" That's the magic one. Up until this point, we were talking about the God being the God of promise, as we worked our way through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now with Joseph, Jacob's son, one of his 12 sons, Jacob, of course, is called Israel. All right, Joseph now is showing us something different. He's going to show him that his faithfulness to God is rewarded, even though it doesn't look like it. I mean, let's think about this. Joseph has been given he was given 2 dreams, and it got him sold into slavery.
Yeah.
All right, by talking about it. Okay, now we're going to read about 2 more dreams. But by the way, he's sold into slavery. He goes into Potiphar's house. Looks like everything's good. Then boom, he's in prison. Now we're going to hear 2 more dreams and see what happens.
About the famine? 7-year famine.
Oh, see, good, Janice, good job. No, it's okay. I'm glad you remember.
I didn't read it.
Oh, wow, I did.
Yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, yep. And it's very important how we would look at this.
I read over because I wasn't here.
All right. So let's read Genesis chapter 40. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Sometime later, so Joseph's in prison, this is sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Ooh. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches." How many, Mike?
3.
"As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." That is what it means, Joseph said to him. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days." Oh, like the 3rd day? Okay. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. Key word here is head. All right, so we want to keep that in mind as we read through this. "Lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head, there it is again, right? Head, were 3 baskets of bread. How many baskets?
3.
Okay. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree. There's that word head, right? Hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Now, okay, so I got some good news, and I got some bad news. All right. Now, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the what? Heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so they once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Rats. The dirty, rotten rat. No good for nothing rat. Alrighty.
He was so happy he got his position back,
He forgot all about him. Okay.
That happens.
So how many dreams are there here?
3.
2.
Oh,
2. 2 dreams. How many dreams did Joseph have when he was back at...
2.
2. All right. Pretty soon, if we do make our way to chapter 41, guess how many dreams Pharaoh's going to have?
2.
2. All right. Okay, so that seems to be what God is doing with these dreams. All right, so now let's go back to verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker, the king of Egypt, offended their master. We don't know how, we don't know why, but let's talk about this for a second. What do you think a cupbearer does?
he tastes all the wine before he
Gives him to the
gives
Pharaoh.
it to the Pharaoh.
And why?
Because he's afraid to get poisoned.
Exactly. It's not about making sure the wine is a good wine or anything like that. This is so he drinks it first, and then they watch. And if it doesn't croak-a-did, he gets to hand the cup over to the Pharaoh. But if it's poisoned, he doesn't get to hand the cup over to Pharaoh. All right. That's one of those jobs where you really hope everybody likes Pharaoh. Okay. Obviously, not everybody really likes Pharaoh. Okay. I also wouldn't have to be worried about being poisoned. This is the kind of thing that happens. Actually, it's not unusual, even in royalty throughout time. The baker, obviously, is just a baker. Right. Nothing dramatic about that. But for some reason, the cupbearer didn't upset Pharaoh as much as the baker did. I mean, we don't know why, but that's what happens.
Or the baker, no one tastes the baker's food before Pharaoh eats it.
Right.
So maybe Pharaoh's saying, I don't trust this guy.
Well, that's always a possibility, you know.
Remember Joseph's dream.
Right. Joseph. He doesn't remember Joseph. When we get to that, we'll talk a lot more about that because that's really funky. So here these 2 guys are, and they're in the same like we've been talking about. They're in the house of the captain of the guard. They're actually this might even be house arrest, versus a prison. So life isn't so bad, but it's incarceration, and they're waiting judgment. They're waiting for the sentencing. So sure enough, Joseph is put in charge over them, and he cares for them. It says in verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned the 2 guys to Joseph, and Joseph attended to these 2 guys. So Joseph's position is not only one of authority, it's one of service. What a wonderful concept. I think Jesus has the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. He's in a position of authority, but he chooses to serve. Pretty cool. After they had been in custody for some time, so again, just think about Joseph again. Joseph hasn't done anything wrong. He's in custody for even as much time as these guys are, and longer actually. Each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, were being held in the prison, had a dream. All right. Joseph notices them. In verse 6, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he's checking in on them. He's making sure they're okay. He finds out that they're not very happy. They're actually very sad, even dejected. And their dejection was what? Why were they dejected?
They had dreams and they couldn't interpret them.
There was no interpreter for their dreams. No interpreter for their dreams. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." So Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So there he is, telling people about the one and true God. All right, I mean, these are Egyptians. They've got hundreds of gods. In this case, though, Joseph's talking about the one true God. So the chief cupbearer tells his story, and Joseph interprets it. Pretty simple. And it's nice to be able to deliver good news, right? But what's the baker's story?
Not too good.
Not too good.
Yeah.
You notice how the two dreams really are distinctly different?
Yeah.
You know, one's happy, happy, glad, glad. I took grapes, squeezed them in Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. All right, so that's very, very positive. The grapes were ripened, and the buds and the branches budded and blossomed. But what can you see about the baker's dream?
Birds are eating them.
The birds are eating it.
Maybe that's what happened. Maybe that's why the Pharaoh was upset. Maybe the bread was all messed up, all picked out.
Yeah, who knows? That could be.
It don't
That could
say.
be. Doesn't say. All right. So here again. So we're down to verse 14. But when all goes well with you, okay, remember this is what Joseph tells him. Remember me, and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. The chief baker, though, his situation is that, again, the 3 days, based on the number of baskets, and the birds eating them. Just keep in mind the birds eating the bread, too, by the way. I know it's kind of gruely, but we'll get to that. This is what it means, Joseph tells him in verse 18. And he tells him that, in verse 19, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head, all right?
Lift
And hang,
off your head.
Yep, and that was, he'll hang him, and where his head will come up.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. Your neck breaks. And hang you on a tree, and then what's going to happen to his flesh?
The birds are going to peck at it.
Just like it is the bread baskets, right?
Yes.
Just like the bread baskets. So it's a symbolic dream, but it's real specific and gross. Then unfortunately, on the third day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of the officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, but he hanged the chief baker. And we said, verse 23, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. For those of us who remember from Exodus, okay, the story of Exodus begins by telling the story of something about Joseph. Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. But Exodus starts out mentioning Joseph, who's already dead and has been dead for a long time. It says, and then arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not remember Joseph. So this is 2 times that Joseph gets forgotten. Now, when we get to later on, we'll find out why it's so important that pharaohs remember Joseph. Right? We'll understand that what Joseph did for Egypt, and that for a long period of time, the pharaohs will remember Joseph for what he did for Egypt. Okay. All right, so we're going to find out about that right now. So are we ready to, can we do 41?
Yeah.
All right. This was a little longer. Okay.
That's it, right?
Okay. So we're in Genesis 41, and begin with verse 1. When 2 full years had passed,
Oh my God.
oy vey, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, that big river in Egypt. When out of the river there came up 7 cows. That's another one of the numbers of God. 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up on the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Verse 5. He fell asleep again and had how many dreams? A second dream. Ooh, 2 dreams. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, Pharaoh's mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one can interpret them for him. All right? Verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, the other man was hanged. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. What? Stop right there. What the heck is he talking about? Joseph can't interpret the dream?
Oh, you don't want to.
Maybe he doesn't want to.
No, he gives glory to God.
To get back at him.
Read the next part. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So again, Joseph did the same thing before. He when he was talking to the cupbearer and the baker, he gave glory to God for the ability to interpret these dreams.
Yeah, he said only God could do it.
Only God can do it. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing, and I'm not going to reread the dreams. All right, everybody knows the dreams.
Yes, the fat cow.
Yep. So now we're down to verse 25. Is everybody okay?
Yep.
Getting to verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. It's just like the ones Joseph had. Joseph had 2 dreams, but they were one and the same. Only it was a little different about the second one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land, to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. We'll stop there and go back and work our way through this. This is so strange. This is really weird. I know we're all angry at the cupbearer, right?
Yeah, 2 years have gone by.
Yeah.
Didn't even remember.
The man that saved his life, right? Restored him back to his position. Yeah, we're all real angry with him. Okay.
Well, that was a good thing. It was a good thing he didn't remember. At the point he's supposed to remember.
It's a great thing he remembered.
Yeah.
Totally
Well,
awesome.
Well, now it's a great thing.
Yeah.
But that's why it turned out, because he didn't remember at first. God didn't have him remember, I think.
How, when Pharaoh is talking about the fact that he's dreams and he doesn't have anybody to interpret them, because remember, his wise men and magicians, they can't figure it out. Okay? Because it can only come from God. What does the cupbearer say?
Oh, he remembered
He remembered,
Joseph.
right? But how did he refer to the fact that he hadn't remembered, that he had forgotten? What did he call it? Yeah, it's
His shortcomings.
yeah, verse 9, shortcomings.
Right.
Well, that's an understatement. The man's been in prison for 2 years.
Yeah.
You know. All right, but at least he repented. That means he took responsibility and he's changed his ways. And he's now going to be able to give Pharaoh the good report. And now Joseph can come out. Look, I don't know what the cupbearer could have done anyways. Okay? What was he supposed to do? Go to Pharaoh and say, look, this guy, interprets dreams. Maybe you'll bring him out then. Might not have mattered to Pharaoh.
Well, maybe if he would have done that, maybe the Pharaoh would have let him out of prison and this wouldn't have come about.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Right. So, but still it's wrong. We understand that. He blew it. And he's admitting it. I like it when people admit they've blown it, and so in this case they did. So verse 9. So then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants and he imprisoned me and the chief baker. Each of us had a dream the same night. Now the young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. All right, and so Pharaoh calls for him. Now, all right, so let's pause. There's Joseph, been sitting in prison now for more than 2 years. All right, maybe even 5 years, 6 years. But he's been sitting in prison for a long time. And all of a sudden, Joseph, you're not going to believe this, but you need to shave. Egyptians didn't really have a lot of hair. Hebrews do. All right, you need to shave. You need to change your clothes. Put something nice on. Why? The king wants to see you. Remember the 2 guys that went back to Pharaoh 2 years ago? All right, there was one of the guys you wouldn't mind going that route, and the other guy you don't want to repeat that, right? So Joseph knows what this could mean. He could be restored, or he also could be hanged. And here he goes. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can't interpret it. I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Baruch Hashem, Baruch Atah Adonai. So, he tells him the dream. In this case, Pharaoh gets both good news and very bad news. I mean, what does it mean to have a famine?
Nothing.
No food.
No food. But for 7 years.
7 years, yeah.
That will wipe Egypt out.
Time.
That will destroy Egypt. And any other country that's dependent upon Egypt for its food. 7 years of famine. This is a big deal. Back in my military days, I was trained this way, then I would pass this on and train other people. We didn't like it when a subordinate came to us with just bad news. We always liked it when they came with bad news and a solution. And that's the way I ran my career. My career, again, I'd go in and see my boss. Sir, ma'am, we have a situation in hand, and here's my recommendation. And that's what Joseph does. He's ready. God has prepared him for this moment and sends him in. Now, I'm using some terms here. And he is prepared for this moment. A woman later in the Bible will also have the same situation. She too will have to go before the king and stand up for her people. And it could mean death to her if the king decided. Do you know what story I'm talking about? Close. There's only so many books of the Bible named after women. Esther.
Esther.
Okay? Esther. Esther has to go into who was her husband, all right, but she's not supposed to go before the king unless he summons her. She goes in anyways, and that means automatic death for her. And she does it. So the story of Esther is very powerful. Jews to this day still celebrate this event with a festival called Purim. And it's a lot of fun. We can do it sometime, and we can do the Purim Spliel. That's actually where you most often you hear that Yiddish term Spliel story. What Jewish people do every year to remember Esther and her courage. And it's also the courage of her uncle/cousin Mordecai, and how Esther saves her people because they were about to get wiped out by another guy named Haman. And so what we do every year is we all get dressed up as though we were in that time. And everybody has roles. So obviously somebody plays Esther, somebody plays Mordecai, somebody plays Haman, somebody plays the king. And we have little scripts that we read from. And it's right from the book of Esther. And we talk about what went on there. And by the way, we always use noisemakers and yelling and screaming because every time you hear the name Mordecai, everybody goes, yay! Mm-hmm. And whenever you hear the name Haman, everybody, boo! And if you ever see the movie The Untouchables,
Yeah.
all right, with Sean Connery, his character says it one time. He says, I'm going to hang you higher than Haman. So it's a great story. Again, we could do Esther sometime and read the book of Esther and see, again, how God raises up people to save the children of Israel, the Hebrews. All right. Here's one time God's using a Hebrew to save the Egyptians and the Hebrews. We'll get to that in a little bit. All righty? So this is a big deal. This is a very, very big deal, what's going to go on in here. So Joseph actually gives him the recommendation. Now, guys, I don't know if Joseph had was at himself in mind when he's making this recommendation. All right? This is verse 33. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They shall collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. All right. I'm amazed that Pharaoh went along with this, and that Pharaoh appointed Joseph.
Joseph's dreams were always, whenever he interpreted something, they came true. So the Pharaoh really couldn't doubt him.
So here Pharaoh has the word of one guy, his cupbearer.
But he said
that those two,
from God.
Right. But Pharaoh, again, this is not something I don't think was common for Pharaoh. I don't think Pharaoh's a godly man, but he's following this. But Pharaoh trusts Joseph. There was just something about Joseph that people trusted.
Yeah.
Okay? Potiphar trusts. The warden trusts. Now Pharaoh trusts. To give him in charge of all of Egypt? To this Hebrew? This guy that he was just pulled out of prison? That Potiphar probably said, look, the guy may have made a pass at my wife. But it goes back to what Lynn's saying. There's definitely some issues there. But Pharaoh makes this great step of faith. And trust him. I just think there's something about Joseph. All right, I think Joseph being
God said, if you let his light shine through you, even if those people aren't believers.
Right. Well, that's the book of Matthew. That's Matthew 5. Right. Let your light so shine before all men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
That's probably what's happening.
That's exactly what's happening here. Okay? Same thing for us. The same thing for us. We can let God's light shine through us so that other people can see that in us and glorify God. That's exactly what happens in Joseph. That's exactly what Christ taught in Matthew 5. Pretty neat stuff. So then it does. There he is. He's given authority over all the land and to implement this plan. Now, mind you, 7 years are going to go by. The people are going to have 1/5 of their food taken away from them. Anybody here ever had 1/5 of your food taken from you?
Not that I know of.
No.
No, no, no. All right, military guys, we're used to not eating a whole lot.
Yeah.
Okay? And so when you don't have a whole lot to eat, it'd be a real drag if they tell you you can't eat all your chow. The only thing I can really imagine is I remember when I used to have to run around to my Marines and tell them not to drink all their water. And we'd be in the jungles or we'd be in the deserts, like that too. They hated me for it. All right, they hated me for it. I remember one time we used to have these things called Lister bags, and we put water into them, and I had to go test the chlorine levels in them because if there wasn't enough chlorine, the bacteria could grow. And this is out in the desert, and sure enough, I found one of the Lister bags that the chlorine level was way too low, and it was possibly contaminated, and I had to shut it down. I was nobody's friend. Nobody's friend. All right. So here now, the people of Egypt are going to be told, we're cutting back 1/5 of your food. Why? Pharaoh said so. Okay. Why is Pharaoh saying that? Well, because this Meshuggah right here, all right, said that in 7 years we're going to have a famine. And they're saying, wait a minute, the food is abundant. We're tripping over it, all right? And they're going, and there's supposed to be a famine coming. Well, sure enough. So that's where it goes. All right, so let's go on. So this is verse 41, and then we'll take it to the end of the chapter and we'll be done. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, Make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanatha Paneah, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea, and it was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and said, It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim, and said, It is because of God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, there was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. So Joseph's not just saving Egypt. All right.
Praise God.
We're talking about Jesus as a archetype of talking Joseph as an archetype of Jesus. Can you see anything in this passage that we just read that connects you to Jesus? We'll read more about this when we do Joseph. I'm sorry, when we do John. We got too many J names here. Joseph, Jesus, John. When we read John. Do you remember, how old was Jesus approximately when he started his missionary work?
30-something.
In his 30s. Right. How old is Joseph?
33.
30. All right. When Jesus first comes out, right, and he's in the desert with John the Baptist, and he's baptized, okay? Do you remember what happens then? There's a voice from heaven.
This is my beloved son,
This is my beloved son,
in whom I'm
well pleased.
well pleased.
Do as
He tells
he
me.
says. Is there anything in here like that?
The Pharaoh's telling all of Egypt. to do
Absolutely.
Do it, Joseph.
He's given the fine clothing again. So again, once again, he gets a nice robe like he had from his father. He gets the gold necklace all around him. Gives him a signet ring like that, and then he puts him in. And he sticks him in a
Why?
chariot. It says,
Everything.
"Make way for him."
Man,
He's
it's
married.
a shit 14 years.
Say, yeah, yeah. But
14 more years after all he served all those prison years.
yep. So Joseph now is just like Jesus. He is getting from the king, in this case, it's Pharaoh, and in Jesus' case, his father, authority. All right, authority. And so now Joseph goes out and begins to, do his magic to save Egypt and all the lands around him. All right. If you remember, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? The three patriarchs. Jacob eventually has his name changed to Israel. How many sons does Jacob or Israel have?
So many.
Right.
Quite a few.
Right, but we know specifically, just like the disciples, there are 12.
disciples.
12 sons, and 12 sons, right, very good. So there are 12 sons of Jacob or Israel. Joseph's one of them. If you remember, we were talking about, I teased you a lot, about through which line of the 12 sons does King David come,
Judah.
and eventually Jesus? Judah. Why not Joseph? We just read it. It's right there. We got to go all the way back to Isaac. We got to go all the way back to Rebekah, why she did not want Esau to have the blessing.
He wasn't the chosen one. It was supposed to be his son, right?
Well, she didn't want Esau to have the line because he was marrying
Oh, yeah.
Rachel.
Canaanites.
Canaanites.
Right, the Canaanites.
The
And
Romans.
right, you're exactly right. Jacob marries Rachel. Okay? All right, of the family. Hebrews. Who does Joseph marry?
an Egyptian.
An Egyptian.
Yes. Yeah.
But not that he was just he couldn't turn Pharaoh down. That would have been an insult.
Oh, it's not. There's nothing right or wrong here. God has already determined the line's going to go through Judah.
Oh yeah.
God's already determined that.
And
So,
this is why, because
But yeah, this is what's going to happen
set
here.
Joseph up for
Right. And then when we read Ruth, remember, Ruth's a Moabitess. And, it's that line is going to go through there, all right, because of the fact that, she will marry into the line. And then she'll eventually, her line will bring King David and eventually Jesus. But this is where it's happening. So, again, we wonder why, of all the people, Judah be chosen. All right. So now we get to see this going on down. As we get ready to read chapter 42, it is essential that you remember what Joseph has done, not only for the Egyptian people, for all the countries all around. If you want to go back and pull out your map of Africa, remember Egypt is in northeast Africa, right? More really North Africa. There's the Red Sea that separates it from Sinai, that big, humongous desert that eventually gets you to Canaan, or what we call Israel. And that's where Jacob is living, Israel, with the rest of his family. And they're getting hit by the famine too. So if you look, to the west of Egypt, you see Libya, and you go south, and and either southeast also, and see other countries. They're all going to starve. But something funny happened in Egypt. And so, as a result, the fact that, you got to go where the food is, a certain group of people are going to come down from Israel, from Canaan, looking for food. And guess who's in charge?
It's interesting that Pharaoh too is because in Egypt they worship many gods, right?
Yes.
And yet he says, "Can we find?" He's already gone to everybody in his land that he would consider powerful enough to be able to interpret his dreams, and all of them said, "We can't do it." And then all of a sudden he gets this guy, and he says, "Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God?" He's actually believing. I mean, he probably believes in a lot of gods, but he believes there's a God inside Joseph. So that's why he would give him the trust and the power.
Yep.
He puts him on a God level.
Yep. Amen.
And that's why all this happened. That's interesting, because when Moses didn't quite believe the same way, it was a different Pharaoh, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's the Pharaoh who had forgotten Joseph.
Yeah.
See why the Pharaoh should always remember Joseph? He saves not only Egypt, but all the whole regions. And that's when Moses, the story of Exodus begins. There arose in Egypt a Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph. All right? They didn't get his history degree. And so that's that. But now Joseph's faithfulness is going to be rewarded in other ways as well. And but Joseph is going to have a hard time just being forgiving. He's going to kind of revert back a little bit to the way he was before. And but we'll have some fun reading that story as we get closer and closer to the end. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
40 and 40.